We're going to be covering a lot of content in my session today, and I do talk about resiliency, I talk about farming, I talk about a number of different subjects, high tech and telecommunications, I talk about retail and every single part of society and how it's going to change in the next 5, 10, 20 years. As a futurist, I research, I speak to people in the industries to understand where we are today, and I try and work out what's happening in the research laboratories, in the startups, in large companies that are investing in research and development, and try and extrapolate out 5, 10, 20 years into the future about where we're going to go. And that's really what I'm going to cover today. But I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about myself. I grew up in the southwest of England in Somerset in a small village called Martock. Here's a picture of downtown Martock. And those 5,000 people, when I was born in 1972, there were like 3 banks, something like 11 pubs. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting how the Brits like equate the health of a town to the number of pubs that are there. But my father moved there with my mother and myself to manage the slaughterhouse. 5,000 people, slaughterhouse in the middle of the town, surrounded by dairy farms. So I grew up in farming communities. I grew up in farmland. I understood that every 2 weeks they'd be emptying the blood tanks, and that was what the smell was, right? Particularly bad during the summer. But now, if you go back to Martock in Somerset like I did last Christmas, there's no banks, there's no slaughterhouse, that's moved far, far away. There's 1 dairy farmer. There's only 2 pubs, right? Things have changed. The world changes over time. And this is what this presentation is about, is that we're never stopping. In fact, everyone in the audience is a futurist. Everyone in the audience thinks about the future. We're just not aware about how powerful that is in our strategic planning. I'm going to encourage you to look out 5, 10, 20 years into the future and think about what agriculture could be and what some of those practices are today that can come in and help you sort of revolutionize how you work. And the revolutions come from technology coming together. And I talk about industrial revolutions, and there's 3 main dimensions to an industrial revolution: communications, energy, and transportation. Over the last 250 years, innovations in each of these areas and how they've crossed over has caused massive growth in population, longer lifespans, larger cities, larger economies, growth in GDP. So these industrial revolutions have brought us to where we are today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those factors that have made us who we are. But I like to talk about change as well. If we look back to 1900 and we go to New York City, here's a picture of New York City, right? Can anyone see where the car is in this picture? There's the car. 13 years later, can anyone see where the horse is in the picture? Change happens quickly sometimes. Sometimes technologies are so groundbreaking that it changes culture, it changes society. And when cars hit the streets, it certainly changed everything there. But over the years, we've seen a number of different revolutions within those industrial revolutions as well. 1900s, electrification of everything. Changed the entire world. Personal computing in the 1960s. 1968, just 51 years ago, a guy called Douglas Engelbart gave a demonstration called the mother of all demos of the world's first personal computer in Silicon Valley. At the point, none of the computer executives that ran the big companies, no one's going to need to have a computer in their home. It's not going to be important. This is fluff. Nice research, but yeah, we'll wait and see what happens. And then the internet came in the early 90s, and mobile came as well. And a lot of people missed these trends. And then everyone has got mobile telephony. By 2020, we're going to have about 6 billion smartphones in the world. That's more people in the world with access to mobile telephony. They've got access to clean running water. So what's the priority in life, right? You go to places like Africa and India and whatever, everyone's got mobile phones to do banking, to do a number of different things. Incredibly powerful. And in the 2010s, we've now got the advent of artificial intelligence. It's been around since the 1950s, but now we've got the firepower in terms of, processing speed and the ability to store data, the cloud, the application that can really change industries like agriculture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And today we're in the 4th industrial revolution. So things are changing faster than ever before. The world runs on data. By 2025, there's going to be about 163 zettabytes of data created every single year. That's the equivalent of a billion high-definition movies. A lot of that is going to be processed in real time. We're only going to be able to store about 0.5% of that and to use that for our benefit around working out efficiencies in business or finding new product lines or changing how we manage the farm. This fourth industrial revolution is defined by digitized communications, renewable energy, and automated transportation and logistics. And behind that is the internet, and behind that is the cloud. So this is the new world that we're working in. And I talk about things called signals of change. These are the things that I see every single day, whether I'm walking around, chatting to people, interviewing people, reading academic reports, reading the news, looking at industries and doing research in deep dives that show me that the world is changing. I am a futurist, but I look at today, and I look at where we've come from, and then I work out where we're likely to head into the future. And that provides a lot of value. If you can look into the future, and you can bring that into your strategic planning, it creates a much more robust process. And I've worked with over 300 clients in the last 4 years. Some of the biggest companies in the world, some of the largest investment funds in Canada as well, up to $200 billion. And I've helped them really understand that things are changing. So when I was asked to come here, they said, can you talk about climate? Can you talk about water? Can you talk about resiliency? And I'm like, absolutely. I actually work with the United Nations, and I went down to South Korea earlier this year to speak at Resilience Frontiers. I was the opening keynote. I talked about resilient solutions in the face of climate crisis and what I'm calling climate survival. We're kind of in a tough situation today. This is an image from Berkeley Earth, a very trusted source on tracking how warm the planet is getting. And you can see from like the 1970s to today that the planet is warming. It's directly correlated to the amount of CO2 we've been pumping out into the atmosphere that come from the industrial revolutions that come before us. And earlier this year, we saw some pretty extreme weather conditions that made me really think, okay, now things are getting pretty serious. In February, do you remember the polar vortex that came down? Minus 51 that night in Chicago. I was in Kitchener-Waterloo. It was minus 47. Pretty much people can't survive in that if they're outside, right? Also, if you're in Australia in that same week, earlier this year, it was plus 60 degrees. So there's extremes everywhere. And this is a picture of the Earth mapped to the heat that there was last July in 2018. We're getting pretty toasty warm. We can see that the weather is changing, and James, that's going to speak after me, is going to talk about the natural flow of weather. I'm focused on the things that we do having an impact by putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and then that continuing to warm the planet. And it's pretty dire in terms of if we look out. So the IPCC put together a report earlier this year, and they said we need to keep the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2100. If we do that, we've got a chance of really maintaining a lot of the ecological ecosystem that we have today. Yes, it's going to be destroyed in some part, but we're going to have some semblance of hope that we can start to rebuild it a little bit. Well, we're not doing a very good job of hitting that target, even with all of the different protocols and alliances across the world. We are actually still burning a lot of oil and gas and still coal. It's slowing a little bit, which is good, but we're still burning a lot, and we're still pumping more CO2 out into the atmosphere than we ever have done before. We're kind of at a critical point, because the United Nations came out 2 weeks ago and said, you know what, by 2100, based on our calculations, we're going to be nearly 4 degrees warmer. What happens at 4 degrees warmer than today? No Arctic ice during the summer, rising sea levels, increased poverty. Rising sea levels is really important to understand. A lot of countries may just disappear, especially some of the Pacific Islands. Bangladesh, almost completely ruined. My property in Vancouver is going to be a nice waterfront property by that point in time. I'm not sure if that's going to be good for investment or not. Increased risk of extreme events, mass population migration, ecosystem disruption, and most importantly, reduced agricultural yields. So it's going to affect us directly. And we're not going to wait to 2100. We're going to see the effects year on year on year. And Mark Carney, great Canadian, is the governor of the Bank of England. And he's just been brought on by the United Nations to be one of their advocates. And he basically says this: companies that don't adapt will go bankrupt without question. Companies that do not move towards a sustainable, renewable way of working will go bankrupt. Over 130 banks in the world that manage about $47 trillion in assets have come together to adopt principles from the United Nations to try and put pressure on the companies that are still pushing an agenda of pulling fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them as part of industry, and as part of large business that's still undertaking practices that are not sustainable for the planet and actually healthy for the planet as well. So that's the climate piece. But to go with climate, we have to look at water as well. And NASA runs a really interesting program called GRACE, and it uses satellite imagery to work out the state of water in the world. And what they've actually found recently is that the dry parts of the world are getting drier and the wet parts of the world are getting wetter. This isn't necessarily a good thing. There's not balance. If you've got that, that's really going to affect the quality of life in all of those places. No one is sort of escaping with anything. By 2100, things are going to get pretty desperate. And if we look at Canada, it's pretty interesting. I was chatting to some experts and professors that talk about water and water conservation, about water strategy. And one of the things that they highlighted was that Canada does not have a nationwide water strategy, which absolutely boggled my mind. Because it's such an important resource, only 1% of the world's water is drinkable and usable for human consumption. And we've got tons of it in Canada. And we seem to not do a very good job of managing it. It's a tour de force, these natural events. In fact, we've had a huge amount of catastrophic insured losses in Canada. 4 out of 6 of the big moments of the past sort of 20, 30 years have been around water, whether it's droughts or whether it's flooding, whether it's about the wind and the rain, whether it's about ice. So we need to understand that water is an important part of how we run our business, and we know more than anyone else in this room that defines how our year is going to be. And as we've got this climate change happening and the warming of the planet, water is going to be something that really changes how we do business. And it's going to have some bad years and it's going to have some good years. But the bad years might start multiplying. But what's really interesting to understand about water is this: there's a direct correlation between the availability of water and the ability to generate energy. There's a water energy nexus. And the water energy nexus means that we need to increase energy consumption and in turn increase the availability of water for usage in the generation of that energy. By 2035, the world's energy consumption will increase by 35%, which in turn will increase water consumption by 85%. But also, in 2030, there'll be a 40% shortfall of available water across the globe. The effect will be on 98% of global electric power generation. I mean, here in Canada, I spent a lot of time living in BC, hydro. Now I live in Ontario, it's a very different story, and here in Alberta, it's an even different story as well. But I think it's time to look at energy futures and think about how the world can change. And I've been coming to Alberta for about 4 years. I remember I spoke at the Growing the North conference in Grand Prairie 4 years ago and gave a very similar presentation to this. And it didn't go down so well. Today, I'm now chatting to some of the people that work in the industry, the oil and gas industry, fossil fuel industry. I'm chatting to the unions. And a lot of people want to change. And a lot of people know that change is inevitable. In fact, some of the projections on how that change is going to happen is like by 2030, the next 10 years is going to be a huge amount of change. By 2030, oil could be $10 a barrel, and we could be moving en masse away from the usage of fossil fuels, which is a good thing. But it's bad for places that made a lot of their money from energy. But I think that the places that have made their money from energy can still make their money from energy and transition to a new world. There's a huge amount of investment, trillions and trillions of dollars. $10.2 trillion will be invested by 2040 in world's energy supply. 75% of that is going to be in renewables. And countries like China have got a step ahead of a lot of people around the world. This is a company in China called Green Panda. They build massive solar farms in the shape of pandas. You can see them as you fly over China and Mongolia. And China's going to become a global power in energy supply, and it's going to be renewable energy. Why? They don't have oil and gas. If they could be completely independent of anyone else, that gives them a lot more power. Down in Australia, you've got the Hornsdale wind farm. Elon Musk and Tesla helped them put in a battery pack down there, and they're extending it now. And what they've actually found is that they've solved a lot of the problems with energy supply in southern Australia by utilizing wind farms, storing that energy, releasing it when it's needed. It cost about 90 million Australian dollars. In the first year of operation, it delivered $30 million worth of value. So if you think about it, within 3 or 4 years, paying back the investment is pretty special in terms of an implementation. And in agriculture, we can look at new ways of deploying renewable energy generation onto our land. This is a picture of a farm out in Germany. And they actually put solar cells over the top of crops. I find this interesting because suddenly farmers can earn money from energy generation, which certain places in the States, it's actually more efficient to earn money from just turning arable land into solar generation, into land that you can do solar generation and you can grow crops on. I think these are game changers. These are new ways of thinking. This is thinking that comes from farmers, right? And also, there's the use of things like anaerobic digesters. Being able to use like the slurry from farms and food scraps from places like Whole Foods come together. They put them together in these digesters and they generate electricity from them. It's incredible. It's another line of business for farmers. And as I look at these technologies, I see a huge amount of hope for you, a huge amount of hope for the world. The people that create an incredibly vibrant ecosystem of business, it's always been from agriculture, as well as a number of other businesses. But what's really interesting about the generation of electricity is the fact that, you know, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, so battery technology and storage, we saw that in Hornsdale in that example that I spoke about, but now battery technology is plummeting in terms of cost to implement. It's going to get cheaper and cheaper over time. And new battery technologies coming in to even supersede lithium-ion, sodium-ion batteries as well. But here's a vision of what people are thinking that the world is going to be. And this isn't 2050, this is probably going to be closer to 2060, 2070. A global renewable energy grid where energy can travel in real time from country to country and provide all the energy we need incredibly cheaply. This is already being started in China and across Asia. There's something called the Asian Supergrid. 5 countries are coming together to generate electricity and to pass it between the countries. So watch out for that. In the next 10 years, that's going to be proven technology, and in the next 20, we're going to start to build out this infrastructure. Is this a long shot? Is this science fiction? Think about how the internet works. It works in exactly the same way as this. Cables that run under the ocean and across countries, passing communications and data. Why can't you do the same thing with electricity? I'm certain this is going to be our future. But then thinking about the electrification of the world, what about transportation? It's certainly something we all have a reliance on in agriculture. Now, I took this picture last year in Vancouver when I was living there in Pacific Center. My car's the second on the left. It's Ziggy. It's a Chevrolet Bolt. It's 100% electric. But we've also got an Audi, a BMW, and a Kia there as well. Does anyone in the audience drive an electric car? Or a hybrid? Yes, one person out there, or hybrids. And there's a few hybrids. There's one person with an electric car. Well done. It's hard to get in. They're really expensive. Luckily, I bought mine in BC where there was still some tariffs. But now, the electrification of transportation is starting to take hold, and big changes are happening. So Tesla's coming out with its electric truck, and there's a lot of other manufacturers that are coming out with fully electric trucking. You've got car ferries in Norway, 100% electric. Down in China, they've actually got these container ships that go up and down the Yangtze River. This ship here goes 40 miles up the Yangtze, takes about 2-3 hours to recharge. It takes about 2 or 3 hours to reload it, and it goes back down the Yangtze. Ironically, they take coal up the Yangtze as well. There's not always sense in the world, but But if you look to China as well, cities like Shenzhen are 100% electric buses, electric municipal transportation. They're rolling out about 6,000 to 7,000 electric buses every 4 or 5 weeks in China. There's about 460,000 electric buses in China today. Can anyone guess how many electric buses there are in the US operating today? 300. The new world is renewable energy and electrification. And who's winning? By 2030, China is going to be the biggest economy in the world. The second biggest economy in the world is going to be India. And the third biggest economy in the world is going to be the US. These people are starting to get an advantage in the world. And then you've got companies like Rivian, and Amazon have invested heavily in Rivian, but they've also put an order in for 100,000 delivery trucks. These are the signals that show me that the world is changing significantly in terms of transportation. But what about farming? SolarTrack's a really interesting company. They do very small tractors for small-scale farming. And I really love how they're looking at applying electrification into a farm environment. And then you've got the E100 Vario, which is a much larger scale tractor. We've still got challenges today. They've only got about 4 or 5 hours of power on board. It takes about 4 or 5 hours to recharge them as well. That doesn't work on the farm right today, but it's going to get better. And it's about finding the application in the right areas of going to an electrification of your infrastructure to make that work. And then I start to think about artificial intelligence and data. I start to think about automated operations. We've seen in the press, automation is coming. Jobs are going to be destroyed. Terminator is coming. You know, these aren't necessarily true in the same way. Yes, jobs are going to change. Tasks within the jobs are going to change. I don't see a world where hundreds of millions of people are suddenly going to be put out of work by a robot. I just don't see it. That's a science fiction narrative that's perpetuated by various analysts and various media outlets. But artificial intelligence is coming to transportation, and it's going to change everything.
I am the GGL 4000, optimized to make your transportation safe and enjoyable. Please enter on the passenger side. Please enter on the passenger side. Please replace my head.
Robots can take our food, our clothes, and our homes. But they will never take our cars. Introducing the 2011 Dodge Charger, leader of the human resistance.
Okay, 2011, leader of the human resistance. I don't know who's driving that car. That's not responsible, right? But in 2011, this was it. No one believed that artificial intelligence and technology would accelerate to a point where self-driving cars will be an absolute reality. Cut to today. Google's Waymo, self-driving cars. Its market cap is $105 billion. Interestingly enough, down about $70 billion from when I used to give this presentation last year, because it's taking a long time to make it happen in the marketplace. But also, if you look at Chrysler's market cap, it's $20 billion. Who's going to win the future? Right? That's a huge change. The irony here is that Waymo used Chrysler's cars as the basis for their self-driving cars. The only money that Chrysler is making in this deal is selling vehicles that are probably going to become obsolete. Because will Google make their own vehicles? I'm pretty sure Google will make their own vehicles eventually, right? So these signals show me that the world is changing. And we've seen automated farming happen for quite a long time, but now we've got these automated tractors like the Vario here. And then we've got these researchers trying to really challenge how we do farming using automation as well. And here's a short video from a group of researchers in the UK, and they run a project called Hands-Free Hectare.
We wanted to prove that there was no technological reason that a field can't be farmed without humans, and we have done that. Our main challenge for harvest was getting the combine ready. Spent a lot of time practicing, getting our headland turns right, and on the day they seem to be perfect, which is amazing to see that happen.
What we had was a little Sampo combine. It's a smaller header unit than it's generally used within harvesting. The idea behind it, despite it being an aged machine, was to actually have ability of having smaller machines running together. So it's only got 2 meters header on the front of it that allows us to, in theory, start catching more precise yield counts of what's actually going on in our field. The idea behind actually having multiple machines as well is to actually have them running together in fleets, and just with smaller machines that are going to produce less damage to our fields and produce less compaction to the entire area of what we're cropping.
I mean, this is an ideal world. It's a closed environment, you know. It's easy to sort of master that. But now they're taking on the challenge of seeing how you can deploy this kind of technology at scale. And now you've got smaller robotics and AI hitting the fields as well. You've got robots that can actually go down and they can find weeds on the ground and just apply the herbicide when they need to, right? Changes everything. Makes it more efficient as a farming operation. And this is a company called the Small Robot Company out of the UK, and they envisaged about 4 or 5 different models of very tiny robots scurrying around fields, doing certain tasks for us, like drones in the air as well. I find it fascinating. It's completely new ways of looking at how we do things, and that reimagination is going to help redefine the world. I was chatting to a few people last night, and we were talking about data and platforms and opportunity. We're talking about some fears and opportunities to change, the challenges that are there. So I actually put together a new section here, which is called Empowering Agriculture, which is around data. The conversation about data empowering operations on the farm has sort of gained pace over the last few years. We've always known that data's been important, but it's been a natural process. But now we've got data, information being turned into useful knowledge, and ultimately the wisdom of the farm and the farmer coming in to help optimize how we run our operations. And today, that can be incredibly powerful if we can capture data and put it into platforms and run analytics and data science against it. You know, strategic planning and yield prediction, risk management, food safety and spoilage, operations and equipment management, and farmer-to-farmer connections. And there are companies that are really changing how we connect. There's a company out of the UK called FarmR. It's like the Airbnb for farming equipment. So you can just rent farming equipment from other farmers when it's not being used, right? You know, the tractor's not always used. The combine's not always used. Other equipment isn't always being used. So how can we make money? How can we liberate that from being idle to being very useful in the world? So I love platforms like this. There's another platform, the Farmers Business Network, you know, connecting farmers to each other, disrupting the industry as well. These guys have raised about $200 million from everyone from Google to other tech companies. They're based in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is going to come for agriculture in certain ways. But what's really interesting is that some farmers are finding new ways to spread the word about what agriculture is. This is the Millennial Farmer. Does anyone follow this guy on YouTube? Yeah? It's interesting. I only found out about him in the last couple of days. He makes more money from YouTube than he does from farming. I'm not saying go and make YouTube channels. It's very difficult to do that. But this guy is now a young guy and a family that's spreading the word about how important agriculture is and the practices and the realism behind it. And it's incredibly compelling. Hundreds of millions of views for his videos. And now we're in a world where that data pyramid is being disrupted by artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the data, information, and knowledge is being accelerated. We don't have to do the drudge work of data and information. The knowledge is us working with these systems that help us to find new ways of applying our wisdom and new operations, new ways of saving money, new products, new opportunities. And artificial intelligence has been applied in a number of different situations. So IBM Watson has sort of taken on agronomists and what they do. Growers can now film an entire field of corn from a drone and use artificial intelligence-enabled visual recognition analysis to identify crop disease or pest infestation. It's pretty cool stuff. You've got farmers down in Nebraska saying that I can react in real time and won't use yield waiting for the agronomist. Are there any agronomists in the room? Agronomists are going to be okay. they're going to use these tools. It's about farmer and the machine. It's about that hybridization. It's about us being better using technology. It always has been. Then what about exponential farming? Well, we're starting to look at vertical farming, becoming more and more important. Square Roots is a company that's run by Kimball Musk, Elon's brother, and they start to look at using shipping containers for growing food in cities. Bowery Farming, just outside of New York City, is growing microgreens in new ways in vertical farms. We're able to be 100 times more efficient with the space we use compared to conventionally grown crops. It's completely pesticide-free, fungicide-free, and we use 95% water. So remember that water energy nexus, and we need more water available? In a city, growing of food is going to become pretty standard. Cities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. By 2100, we're going to have cities like Lagos, Nigeria, that are going to be 88 million people. It's pretty crazy. And we're going to have food supplies in places like that. Companies like Inox are using fully automated robotics to help them, with planting and with cultivation of crops in a closed environment as well. And these companies are getting hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. What about protein? It's interesting when I talk about the meat market, there's such a huge opportunity there. It's going to be worth $7.3 trillion by 2025, with a 73% increase in demand by 2050. The beef industry and pork industry, chicken industry, whoever. I mean, okay, we're still going to be part of the story. Silicon Valley, the big tech companies are like, we want some of that. How can we disrupt that? How can we change the world? So there's a lot of people stepping up. I'd like you to meet Ian the chicken. This is Ian. He's retired, and he lives on a lovely farm in Southern California. He works for a company called Just. On the right is some chicken breasts that have been grown from Ian's cells. Cellular meat production is coming. It's going to take a while. Next 10 years, we're going to see huge leaps and bounds. In 2 months, 50,000 tons of pork cells could be grown per bioreactor by using starter cells from 10 pigs. Now things get interesting, right? If you think about how long you need to raise a cow or raise a pig, raise chickens, versus being able to grow cells in a factory in a matter of months, it gets really interesting from a business perspective and disruption perspective. In fact, there's a research agency down in California called Rethink X, a guy called Tony Sieber and his colleagues, that says by 2030, and this is pretty bold, okay, the number of cows in the US will have fallen by 50%, and the cattle farming industry will be all but bankrupt. Now, when I share this report with everyone, there's a link at the bottom. You can go and read the report, and it does miss some parts of the puzzle. It doesn't talk about culture and family getting together and having food and a preference for real meat versus cellular meat. It's gung-ho about cellular meat. But the industry is under attack from technology players, and the world will change. And it will be a diverse world for us to be able to select how we consume protein. They're trying to reverse the economics and model of food production. They're trying to get away from spending years raising cattle to spending weeks and months growing protein. But is everything that I've spoken about today going to happen? Is it true? Well, there's a lot of research and there's a lot of academics working on these problems. There's a lot of people making very bold claims about how agriculture and the food industry is going to change. There's a guy called Roy Amara that came up with something called Amara's Law. And he says this: in the short term, we tend to overestimate the impact of technology. And maybe you think that my presentation is an overestimation of an impact. But what we found over time, that in the long term, it's a complete underestimation of how the world is changing. AT&T very famously thought in the late 80s, early 90s, that cellular technology was never going to catch on fire. They had to spend billions of dollars getting back in the game because they missed it. Hands up who uses a Windows mobile phone. Microsoft didn't take it seriously. They said that the iPhone was a joke. Hands up who uses an iPhone, right? Things change, and we have to choose to change, or change is going to happen to us. Now, I'm supremely confident that everyone in the room has got that ability to see the future and to also lean into the ideas of sustainable development goals. And this is the United Nations SDGs. Now, I work with the United Nations. I think it's really important to take a look at these. Everything from clean water to good jobs and economic growth. It's a 360-degree view of creating good society and abundance for all. And that's it. We're stepping into a new world. The new world is going to be challenging from a climate perspective, from a water perspective, that water energy nexus. There's going to be lots of challenges coming in to say, you know, we're not going to be using fossil fuels. We're not going to be using normal modes of transportation in a farm context, production in a farm context. Urban growth is going to change everything, and it's going to bring food production into cities. Everything that you do today is important, and I thank you for the hard work you do. Whether you're a supplier, whether you're a company developing new technologies, or whether you're a farmer on the ground, we need you now more than ever. By 2050, we're going to have to boost food supply by 60% to feed everyone. Canada's growing, and we're the people to help feed them. Thank you very much.